In the twilight of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still presented itself as a sovereign giant, an ancient power whose banners had once cast long shadows over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. From the shores of the Bosphorus, the imperial capital gleamed with the confidence of a state that believed its own myths. That tradition guaranteed survival, that divine authority ensured stability, and that the empire's sheer age was proof of its endurance. Diplomatic ceremonies continued. Soldiers marched through Istanbul's avenues, and the Sultan's court maintained its ritual grandeur. To most observers, the empire appeared weakened, yes, but not doomed. It looked like a wounded lion still capable of roaring. Yet beneath this surface, a different reality unfolded. A slow, suffocating financial collapse that ordinary citizens could not see, but would soon feel in every aspect of their lives. The Ottoman treasury, once nourished by vast territories and trade routes, had become a hollow vault echoing with unpaid promises. Increasingly, the empire was not ruled by its sultans, ministers, or religious authorities, but by the European creditors who financed its survival. With each passing year, foreign banks, not Ottoman, officials decided the pace of reforms, the construction of railroads, and even the collection of taxes in remote provinces. Debts mounted like storm clouds, obscuring any illusions of recovery. Wars lost to rising nationalist movements, and European powers drained the treasury. Corruption spread through administrative layers that were too vast to reform and too fragile to dismantle. And while the empire attempted to imitate Europe's modern institutions, the cost of this transformation spiraled far beyond its means. The Ottomans began borrowing not for growth, but merely to repay previous loans, entering a financial spiral that no empire, no matter how ancient, could escape indefinitely. Still, the facade of stability endured. Newspapers reassured. The public imperial decrees promised revival, and foreign diplomats pretended the Ottoman state remained a necessary geopolitical counterweight. But these gestures could not mask the arithmetic of imperial decay. A crisis was forming beneath the polished rhetoric, a crisis driven by money, or rather by the absence of it, and the empire was drifting dangerously close to a point from which no return was possible. Something was horribly wrong beneath the surface, and soon the world would see how financial collapse, more than armies or rebellions, would push the Ottoman Empire toward its final unraveling. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire worked tirelessly to present itself as a state rediscovering its strength. The Tanzimat reforms, announced with great ceremony, promised modernization on every front. New ministries were established, civil codes were drafted, railways began to carve through Anatolia, and telegraph lines connected distant regions with unprecedented speed. Ottoman newspapers celebrated these transformations as proof that the empire was joining the modern world, shedding its reputation as the sick man of Europe. Diplomats from London, Paris, and Vienna spoke cautiously of an Ottoman resurgence, a revival built on ambitious reforms and the determination to keep the empire intact. But beneath this narrative of progress, the economic foundation was far weaker than the state dared to admit. Modernization required vast financial resources, far more than the empire's aging and inefficient tax system could provide. The reliance on tax farming drained revenues through layers of middlemen. Corruption remained endemic, ensuring that little of what was collected ever reached the imperial treasury. Meanwhile, the empire's most profitable territories were slipping away. The Balkans gained autonomy one province at a time. Egypt charted its own administrative and economic course, and nationalist movements chipped at the empire's revenue base just when modernization demands were reaching their peak. Unable to fund its reforms domestically, the Ottoman government increasingly relied on foreign loans. At first, borrowing appeared to be the solution. European capital to finance railways, modern armies, and administrative restructuring. But the loans came with punishing terms, high interest rates, short repayment schedules, and intrusive clauses that gave European bankers influence over Ottoman fiscal decisions. What looked like financial assistance was, in truth, a quiet transfer of sovereignty. Each loan chipped away at the empire's control over its own economy. The illusion of prosperity persisted only because credit masked the empire's structural weaknesses. Railways and modern barracks stood as symbols of progress, yet they were financed by debt the empire could never realistically repay. What appeared outwardly as growth was actually borrowed time, purchased at the price of future autonomy. Thus, beneath the polished facade of reform and modernization, a lethal economic pressure was building. The empire was becoming dependent on foreign creditors, trapped in a financial system that made collapse not just possible but inevitable. The breaking point came with a decision that Ottoman leaders believed would buy them time, but instead sealed the empire's fate. By the 1870s, the treasury was drowning in obligations it could no longer meet. Wars in the Balkans, costly modernization projects, and shrinking revenues had pushed the Ottoman state to the edge of insolvency. European banks, once eager to lend, now raised interest rates and imposed increasingly humiliating conditions. Faced with immediate repayments it could not afford, the Ottoman government made its most fateful economic choice, the suspension of debt payments in 1875. It was a declaration of financial exhaustion, a desperate attempt to halt the bleeding and renegotiate terms, but to the world's financial powers it was an unforgivable breach of trust. Ottoman officials hoped that suspending payments would force creditors to the negotiating table, allowing the empire to regain control over its finances. They believed that foreign powers, reliant on the empire's stability for their own geopolitical interests, would accept temporary losses. It was a gamble rooted partly in desperation, partly in a misreading of Europe's intentions. In truth, the suspension of payments did not strengthen the empire's bargaining position, it shattered it. Instead of relief, the Ottomans invited intervention. European bondholders erupted in outrage. Newspapers across the continent mocked the empire's mismanagement, and diplomats saw an opportunity to transform financial leverage into political dominion. The empire's credibility collapsed overnight. What followed was the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a foreign-controlled institution that seized control of vast portions of the empire's revenue streams. Salt taxes, tobacco revenues, and other essential income sources were now collected not by Ottoman officials but by foreign-appointed administrators. It was a financial occupation in all but name, turning the empire into a ward of European powers. What Ottoman officials viewed as a necessary step to preserve sovereignty became the very mechanism that eroded it. The suspension of debt payments was the economic point of no return, the moment when the empire lost not just money but autonomy, dignity, and strategic freedom. If you want more hidden stories of economic power, secret deals, and the financial blows that toppled nations, subscribe and let's continue the unraveling. The immediate aftermath of the Ottoman Empire's suspension of debt payments revealed just how fragile the state truly was. Almost overnight, the empire's financial crisis translated into visible fractures across society. Inflation surged as confidence in the government's ability to manage its currency evaporated. Prices of basic goods, bread, textiles, fuel, rose faster than wages, forcing households already living at the edge of survival into deeper desperation. Merchants who had relied on stable trade routes faced sudden shortages. Market stalls emptied. Domestic industry, fragile and underdeveloped, could not withstand the volatility. What had once been a quiet financial imbalance now became a daily burden on millions. The empire's elites felt the shock as well. Landowners saw tax collectors grow more aggressive as the state scrambled to compensate for shrinking revenues. Bureaucrats faced salary delays, sparking discontent within the administrative structure that the Tanzimat reforms had worked so hard to professionalize. The army, already underfunded, struggled to provision its troops. Soldiers went unpaid or were supplied with inferior equipment, fueling resentment in a military already questioning the competence of its commanders and the future of its state. But the greatest blow came from abroad. Foreign creditors, furious at the suspension of payments, pushed their governments to intervene, and intervene they did, with a coordinated pressure campaign that left the Ottoman leadership cornered. The creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881 was not merely a financial arrangement, it was a foreign takeover of the empire's economic organs. French, British, Austrian, and German officials now controlled key revenue streams. They collected taxes directly, bypassing the Ottoman bureaucracy entirely, and used the proceeds to compensate European bondholders rather than fund the empire's needs. Ordinary citizens understood the symbolism. Even if they did not grasp the financial mechanics, their empire was no longer free to govern itself. National pride eroded, anger simmered, the idea that foreign agents could enter Ottoman towns and collect taxes without oversight struck at the heart of imperial legitimacy. These early cracks were not just signs of fiscal strain, they were the psychological and political tremors of an empire losing control. The financial crisis was no longer confined to ledgers and treaties. It was reshaping daily life, destabilizing institutions, and setting the stage for upheavals that would soon move from the streets into the halls of power, and ultimately onto the battlefield. As the Ottoman Empire's financial crisis deepened, economic suffering began to harden into political fury. What started as shortages, inflation, and foreign oversight soon ignited forces that no government, least of all one losing its grip on sovereignty, could contain. Across the empire's vast territories, a sense of humiliation took root. Foreign administrators collecting taxes became symbols of submission, and every new decree from the Ottoman Public Debt Administration reminded citizens that their empire's fate was being negotiated in Paris and London, not in Istanbul. Economic pain sharpened old divides. In the Balkans, communities, already resentful of Ottoman rule, now found justification for rebellion in the empire's visible weakness. Farmers burdened by taxes that now flowed directly into foreign coffers saw no reason to remain loyal to a state that could not protect their livelihoods. Merchants in port cities protested restrictions that favored European traders while suffocating local enterprise. Even the empire's wealthy notables, long beneficiaries of imperial privilege, grew uneasy as they watched their revenues constrained by financial controls imposed from abroad. Within the military, resentment reached an explosive intensity. Officers trained in modern academies could plainly see that the empire's inability to fund a strong army was not just a fiscal failure, it was a strategic disaster. The humiliation of foreign control fed a rising generation of reform-minded soldiers who believed the empire could only survive through radical political change. These frustrations coalesced into secret societies, journals, and underground networks that would later emerge as the Young Turks. Economic collapse also emboldened rival empires. Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Britain saw opportunity in Ottoman fragility. Each sought to expand influence in regions where Ottoman authority had been weakened by debt and disorder. The financial crisis became a geopolitical feeding frenzy, with European powers backing nationalist movements, exerting diplomatic pressure, and preparing to seize territories under the justification of stabilizing a failing empire. What tied all these pressures together was money, or rather the lack of it. The Ottoman political system was not collapsing because of one rebellion or one foreign intervention. It was collapsing because its economic foundations had been hollowed out, leaving every social and political conflict amplified and unrestrained. The financial crisis did not merely accompany the empire's unraveling, it was the engine driving it forward, accelerating protests, mutinies, and rebellions into open confrontation. The economic fractures had now become political explosions, and the Ottoman state was heading toward a storm from which it would not return. The full collapse of the Ottoman Empire did not come from a single battle or a single uprising. It came from the compounded weight of decades of financial decay, erupting into geopolitical catastrophe. When the 20th century dawned, the empire was already weakened, but it was the sequence of wars that followed, each fueled by economic desperation, that pushed the state into terminal decline. The Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 were the first devastating blow. Stripped of funding, poorly equipped, and strategically paralyzed by years of financial dependency, the Ottoman military was unable to defend its European territories. Provinces that had once provided crucial tax revenue, agricultural wealth, and manpower slipped away in a matter of months. The loss was not merely territorial, it was a fiscal amputation. The empire's economic map collapsed even further, leaving Istanbul governing a state smaller poorer and more fragile than ever before. Then came the ultimate gamble, entry into the First World War for the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, the empire's only hope of escaping financial bondage and territorial erosion was to align with a great power. The Ottomans believed that a victorious Germany would help them renegotiate debt, expel foreign economic oversight, and restore lost lands. But war once again demanded money the empire did not have. To finance mobilization, the government printed currency without sufficient backing, igniting waves of inflation that devastated civilians. Armies marched on promises rather than provisions. Villages were stripped of grain and livestock to feed the fronts. Infrastructure crumbled under the weight of a conflict the empire was too weak to sustain. As the war turned against the Central Powers, the Ottoman position became untenable. Starvation spread through Anatolia. Trade collapsed. Famine struck regions already destabilized by decades of economic mismanagement. By the time the armistice was signed in 1918, the empire was not simply defeated, it was financially erased. Its debt had ballooned beyond imagination, its economy shattered, its institutions hollowed out. The final moment came with the post-war settlements when Allied powers carved away the remaining Ottoman territories, using the empire's insolvency as justification for occupation and partition. Istanbul fell under foreign control, and the once mighty Ottoman state ceased to function as a sovereign entity. The collapse was total: military, political, territorial, and above all economic. What had begun as a quiet financial crisis had ended in the disintegration of a 600-year empire. In the aftermath of its collapse, the Ottoman Empire left behind a landscape marked by profound economic and social devastation. The end of the First World War and the empire's subsequent dismemberment did not simply redraw borders. It created a vacuum where institutions, livelihoods, and identities were torn apart. Decades of debt dependency and wartime inflation had drained the resources of entire regions. Villages emptied as famine and disease swept through provinces weakened long before the first shot of the war was fired. Infrastructure, railroads, ports, factories lay in ruins or under foreign control. The economy that once connected 3 continents had fractured into isolated pockets of survival, each struggling to find its footing in a world no longer shaped by Ottoman rule. Foreign occupation deepened the wounds. Allied powers seized key territories not only for strategic advantage, but also to claim the remnants of the empire's resources. Oil fields in Mosul, fertile lands in Syria, and crucial ports along the Mediterranean were all absorbed into new mandates. The revenues that might have financed recovery were diverted elsewhere. Former Ottoman subjects now found themselves living under foreign administrators who often cared more about geopolitical interests than local needs. The dismantling of centuries-old administrative systems created confusion and resentment, leaving populations disoriented and economically adrift. For the new Turkish state that emerged from the ashes under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the legacy of Ottoman financial ruin was both a burden and a warning. The new republic inherited staggering debts, hyperinflation pressures, and a population exhausted by years of war and privation. Rebuilding required the creation of entirely new fiscal institutions, the renegotiation of foreign debts, and the adoption of economic policies designed to prevent a return to dependency. But even as Turkey pushed forward, the scars of Ottoman collapse remained visible. Entire regions that had once thrived under imperial trade networks struggled to adjust to the borders imposed by the post-war settlement. Communities that relied on cross-provincial commerce now found themselves cut off from their traditional markets. The long-term consequences extended beyond economics. The collapse reshaped identities, fueling nationalist movements across the Middle East and the Balkans. It fostered distrust of foreign powers whose economic pressures had contributed to the empire's downfall. Generations grew up wary of external influence, conscious of how financial control had preceded political domination. The Ottoman Empire's fall was not just a moment in history, it was a generational trauma that altered the trajectory of nations, economies, and societies from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Its shadow would stretch far into the 20th century, shaping decisions, fears, and ambitions long after the empire itself had disappeared. The fall of the Ottoman Empire offers a stark and enduring lesson about the hidden architecture of power. Empires rarely collapse solely from military defeat or political infighting. More often, the fuse is lit by economics, by decisions made in silence in ministries and treasuries long before the first cannon fires. The Ottomans believed that territory, tradition, and divine legitimacy could withstand the pressures of a changing world. But they failed to grasp a simple truth. A state that loses control of its finances, loses control of its destiny. Debt became the empire's invisible conqueror, tightening its grip year after year, until the sultans no longer commanded their own revenues, their own reforms, or even their own sovereignty. The rulers misunderstood the nature of modernization. They believed that borrowing was a shortcut to greatness, a way to purchase the appearance of progress without building the internal economic strength necessary to sustain it. Instead, every loan they accepted deepened their dependency, empowering foreign creditors who viewed Ottoman fragility not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. What began as financial assistance evolved into external control, and external control evolved into geopolitical dismemberment. Economics did not merely accompany the empire's decline, economics engineered it. This story remains relevant today because nations still fall into the same trap. Governments chase prestige, projects, military expansions, or rapid modernization with borrowed money, assuming future generations will solve the fiscal problems they create. Leaders ignore structural weaknesses, hoping that foreign investment or temporary windfalls will mask deeper vulnerabilities. But debt has no loyalty and creditors have no sentiment. When a nation's economy becomes dependent on external actors, its political independence becomes negotiable. When it can no longer pay, it can no longer choose. The Ottoman Empire teaches that financial sovereignty is not an abstract concern. It is the foundation upon which national stability, political legitimacy, and strategic freedom rest. Lose that foundation, and even the oldest empires can crumble with startling speed. In the end, the real tragedy of the Ottoman collapse is not simply that an empire fell, but that it fell the way so many powers do, slowly, invisibly, and preventably, until the moment when the weight of its economic mistakes finally brought the entire structure crashing down.